G'day folks, welcome to this what I'll call sort of an instructional guide to playing 1914 Serbien Muss Sterbien by Resch. Now the game comes with what we can call the first edition rules. On the GMT Games website there is a living rulebook, and on both Con Sim World on the GMT Games website and on Oregon Consim Games website, there is what people are calling version 3 of the rules. Now, if you play with that version 3 of the rules, there is a lot of extra stuff to download: a new game turn record track, new counter sheet, new combat results table, terrain effects chart, and so forth. I suck at printing my own counters. I don't like doing that, so I'm mainly for that reason, as silly as it is, I'm playing with the version 2 of the rules, which is the living rulebook and the counters that I get with the game from GMT. So this is a guide for version 2 of the rules. So 1914 Serbien Muss Sterbien models operations on the Balkan front when the Austro-Hungarian Empire invaded Serbia. It forces you to focus very heavily on managing your supply and control and command of your units, from small assets to larger formations through to core as administrative structures, command structures, and up to larger armies. You are almost always keeping an eye on where units are and what formation, core, and army they are part of. And there are a lot of limitations on what you can do. Now, the primary combat unit, perhaps the most important unit in the game, are what are known as formations. Now, formations are combat units that have a corresponding attachment marker. So you'll see a unit, might be the 29th Division, and it will have a 29th Division attachment marker. There are other very similar looking units, and these are known as assets. And the way to distinguish assets, I think most easily, is A, they don't have attachment markers, but they also have their base combat effectiveness shown on the counter in a little circle to the left. So your formations, your main combat units, will have a larger combat strength, usually around 10, 11, or 12. They will have an attachment marker. And your assets will usually have a smaller combat value, around 2 or 3, and they will have that little circle base combat effectiveness. That is a quick way to distinguish between the two, and there are important differences because these units together make up what are known as forces, and these are the basis for your movement and combat. So you will put together forces and they will attack the enemy. And a force consists of typically one formation along with up to 2 asset units, and you can add a fort unit to those as well. Or a force can consist of 1 or 2 asset units and a fort unit that are stacked together. But typically that will be your one fighting formation, your main formation, division with the strength of 10, 11, 12, plus 1 or 2 smaller assets and possibly a fort as well. That is a basis for your movement and combat in the game. Now, once you've got that understanding of formations, assets, and they make up forces, your forces then need to be part of a broader administrative structure. In the Austrian army, they form corps, and they are based around the very important corps train, which is usually based just behind the lines somewhere. Now, you'll note that these formations are part of a corps by placing those attachment markers from your formations into the the attachment boxes on that army display. So I said, if you've got the 29th Division, with its attachment marker, you'll place that 29th Division attachment in its corresponding core box on that admin display. So, at the start of this first scenario, the 29th Division of the Austrian Army belongs to the 4th Corps of the Austrian Second Army. So we place the 29th Division's attachment marker in that 4th Corps box, and that 4th Corps box is on the Austrian Second Army display, organisational display. So we understand the sort of hierarchy of command here. Austrian Second Army is the highest level of command. Within that we have 2 corps, one of which is the 4th Corps, and within the 4th Corps we have the 29th Division. And within that, attached to that formation, there may be 1 or 2 small assets. And together, that one formation, the 29th, with those assets form a force. And they can move and fight together. Now, unlike other games where these formations and corps and armies can move around freely and go wherever they want, you're required in 1914 Serbien Muss Sterbien to keep your forces together and coherent and organised. And so on the actual map, you can see how the various corps and the armies have little markers on the map showing where they are. This is mainly for your convenience, so you can quickly look at the map and see where the 4th Corps, where the 9th Corps, where the 2nd Army is operating. You can consult the organisational charts and see what's in there and where things should be going. But beyond that, it's important to keep your forces and formations within what's known as a respective area of attachment. So your formations, your forces, have to stay close to their core train to stay in supply. If that core and the core train shifts out of the army's area of attachment, they need to be, well, during the attachment phase, they can be reassigned to a new army. And that's simply a case of shifting those organisational markers to the new army that they're now part of. So if I were to shift, for example, the 4th Corps into a different army's area of operation, I can attach that 4th Corps to the new army. I can take them out of the 2nd Army and say, well, now I'm allocating them to, for example, the 5th Army's organisational display because I want them to operate within their area of operations. They're in their area, what's known as their area of attachment. Now in 1914 Serbien Muss Sterbien, this is not so much of an issue, it's pretty clear. Obviously in the bigger games, this becomes more important as you're shifting core a lot throughout the lines. Now with the Austrian Army, you can allocate 3 corps to an army. The Serbian forces are more limited, and they have limits on their charts which dictate how many division equivalents you can have within each of those corps. Now, to put it simply, one division equivalent is one division. So you can effectively have, for example, in one of these, 5.5 divisions. So that's 5 full divisions and one effectively half division. Now a half division is an infantry brigade. A cavalry division counts as half. So right here we have 4.5 division equivalents. And an infantry regiment, there are a few of those around, count as a quarter. They are the limits for those Serbian corps. And finally, the Austrians can have independent formations as part of their corps. And they are placed in that little open box at the top of each army display. And Austro-Hungarian cavalry formations can only be independent formations. They can't be attached to a corps. They have to operate independently. So as I said, this is important to understand the hierarchy of command, but it's also important for supply, because a formation that is part of a corps in an army cannot receive supply from a supply unit that is outside of that army. Typically, units will draw supply from their core train, so the 29th Division will draw supply from the 4th Corps train. And in combat, units from different corps are not allowed to combine to attack or defend together. Now, when an asset unit is stacked with a formation, it is treated as part of that formation and draws supply as though it were part of that formation's force. So for all intents and purposes, it draws supply as the formation would. When it is not stacked with a formation, it is considered unassigned, and it has to seek supply basically effectively independently by drawing supply from any other core train within the same army area of attachment. Okay, so we've gone over assets, which are the smaller, roughly brigade size or regiment size units with a little circle on their counter to indicate their base combat effectiveness. We have formations, which are the larger, typically division-sized units, the core of fighting, which have their separate attachment marker, and these combine to form forces that typically stack together, one formation, two assets. Or you can have two asset units in a fort stacked together. Now, they can both fight, they both exert zones of control, and it's pretty typical zone of control rules. They extend out of hexes that are occupied. They don't extend across the Sava and Danau rivers. They don't extend across those impassable mountain hex sites. There aren't many of those on the map, but they are there, and of course zones of control don't cross those. You can trace supply through an enemy zone of control if it is negated by a friendly zone of control. Okay, so a friendly zone of control, friendly unit zone of control, can negate the presence of an enemy zone of control for the purposes of supply. And when checking to see if units are isolated, that unit can use its own zone of control to negate enemy zones of control. Now, while I'm talking about assets and formations, I want to point out just one other difference between the two before I go into movement and combat, and that is this base combat effectiveness. As I said, assets have them printed on their counters typically, whereas formations have this separate attachment marker with their base or their maximum combat effectiveness printed on it, and that goes on the organizational display. Now, when an asset is forced to take a reduction in combat effectiveness, it takes a step loss or a strength reduction, and it's basically flipped over to its reduced side. If it's already on its reduced side, it's eliminated. When a larger formation takes a hit and is required to reduce its combat effectiveness level, it takes a reduction. Combat effectiveness status markers are placed under the attachment marker to indicate effectively the combat effectiveness level, which is that base combat effectiveness shown on that attachment marker, modified by that little combat effectiveness status, which can be -1, -2, and so forth. And that can change because of combat, of force marching, of supply status, and so forth. And so whenever you're required to take a combat effectiveness check, you determine the combat effectiveness level. That is the level that it is at that point of time, simply by subtracting the status marker from that base combat effectiveness. Now, I'll talk about the impact of this in a moment, but if a unit or if a formation suffers its fourth status reduction, it becomes combat ineffective. Now, further reductions in that combat effectiveness will demoralize the formation. It becomes demoralized level 1, and then demoralization level 2, or D1 or D2 markers are placed. Any subsequent reductions in that combat effectiveness are converted into strength reductions. Now, this combat effectiveness level is important for, as I said, force marches and combats. You'll be checking this after force marches and after every combat. And it's pretty straightforward. You roll 2 dice and you compare the result to the force's current combat effectiveness level. Apply any modifiers that are relevant, whether you're force marching or if this was after combat. And if you roll less than that combat effectiveness level, or equal to it, sorry, less than or equal to, you pass. If the modified die roll is higher, you fail your effectiveness check. And the consequences of that failure are listed in a separate chart, depending on what you're doing. Now, the worse a unit gets, the lower its level goes, the more it is affected by these combat status reductions. It goes -1, -2, -3. The next level is combat ineffective, as I said. Combat ineffective -3, that's the 4th level. Then there is demoralization 1, -3, and demoralization 2, -3. Once you reach that combat effective level, your unit will suffer some penalties. They can't initiate attacks or repulses. When they become demoralized, there are further reductions. They can't construct improved positions. They may surrender if isolated and forced to retreat. They must try to recover in circumstances, and so forth. Okay, so as I said, that combat effectiveness level, those status markers, only apply to formations. When an asset lost by itself loses or is forced to reduce its combat effectiveness level, it is simply flipped over to its reduced size. So again, those differences between formations and assets and around combat effectiveness. And that combat effectiveness is tracked on the organizational chart. Okay, so I'll wrap this first video up here. We've covered the importance of command. It is important for supply, but I'll cover supply in a later video. The main thing here is that understanding of the difference between formations as the main fighting unit, assets, which can be attached to formations or serve independently, and they can work as forces, which is your main moving and fighting force, and those forces work together. Okay, so in the next video I'll cover movement, and in the video after that I'll cover combat, and we'll go on from there.